Hey everyone, how you going? Welcome to another Grain and Grape live brewing demonstration. My name is Joel, and today, once again, we are joined by Ben, who is going to show us how to brew a style of IPA that is not juicy or cloudy. What's going on? Surely this is some kind of mistake.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. And I thought I knew what a British IPA was until I started researching this stream. So it's definitely taken me for a loop. It might do for you guys as well. Being sort of BJCP trained and things like that, I had a very strong idea in my mind of what a British IPA was. And yeah, I think what we're making today is going to sort of challenge a few of those.
Yeah, well, it is a style that has a mythology behind it, which I think that I probably, like many people, had wrong. And also it's probably a style that is somewhat neglected, I think, maybe by a lot of home brewers. In general, maybe you could argue English ales or English beers, I mean, apart from maybe porters, which everyone brews, but I know you're a big fan of English
I do, styles. Yeah, I really like British beers. I think there's an elegance in their simplicity, and getting them right is not as straightforward as it can appear from the outside, but they're also quite easy to do okay versions of. So I feel like they're a great beer to start with when you are initially learning. They're kind of like the blues in music.
Okay.
Like you can sort of learn one or two scales and knock your way through a bunch of tunes and think you're doing pretty well, and then when you come back to it, you realise all that stuff you were missing.
Yeah, right.
Like the little subtleties and the nuances, but yeah, I just think they're a brilliant sort of family of beers, and yeah, I'm going to completely bastardise what perception I had of them.
Cool, good.
But,
look forward to it,
so.
Yeah. Oh, well, what does everyone out there think? Do you brew English beers, or in particular, I mean, you got the emphasis on historical today.
Yeah, this is not an English IPA as we currently know them. This is an English IPA as sort of a bit of a bastardisation of the 1700s and 1800s examples I could kind of find enough information on to get a rough recipe idea about. But yeah, I think if I brew another English IPA moving forward, I'm probably going to stick to the BJCP guidelines because it's going to be a little bit more drinkable. But yeah,
so back it's for the exercise, for the fun of it. We're going to.
It's going to be as much a history stream as a brewing stream today, I guess. So
yeah, well, let us know what you all think. Do you brew a lot of English beers, or do you perhaps neglect them in favour of more modern styles? Obviously, the American IPAs are probably the most popular thing at the moment. But yeah, what do you think? Comments in the chat or the comment section below. Let us know your thoughts, and yeah, I think I'm done.
We'll get some stuff.
I'm going to let you take over.
Yeah. So I'm already at temp, so which is handy. So I can just start the recipe, which is good. Water filled in, correct. Pump ventilation. So while it's ventilating the pump, I'm going to do the first stage of pretty much any hoppy British beer, and I apologise for my head being chopped off temporarily. First step of brewing any hoppy British beer is getting as much gypsum in there as you're willing to put in there. I did a beer with Oscar a little while ago, which most of you guys have sort of been customers for a while, coming to the shop. We both like to talk about it quite a lot because it's one of the better beers that either of us have brewed. And we Burtonised the water, which is to say we made it resemble chemically the water from Burton-on-Trent, which is not where IPAs originated, but it's definitely where they were sort of massively popularised and industrialised. And that involved, for roughly 50 litres of beer that we made, we had close on 100 grams of salts went into that water, so it was pretty intense. Today I'm sticking with 10 grams.
So that's Burtonised water is a it's become its own term, I suppose you could say, isn't it? So what's the story there? When you say Burtonised water, just for those who are uninitiated.
So basically Burton-on-Trent is, as we'll sort of go into a little bit later as well when we're talking about kind of the growth and explosion and popularity of the style, but Burton-on-Trent has a very specific water profile. It's very high in sulfates and calcium. And as most of us are kind of fairly aware, the calcium sulfate is really brings out the hoppiness and the bitterness in beers. So these beers had sort of been being made in London, which was still quite popular. But when a Burton brewery started making them, the quality difference from using that local water was drastic, and it kind of timed itself. I'm already getting into history. I'm literally put salts in the water. I'm already talking about the history. It kind of was timed around the same time as railways in England kind of got built. So you had these Burton breweries making these incredibly good IPAs, and then all of a sudden you had a method by which to transport them all around the country to people who wanted to drink them. So it was kind of a perfect storm of circumstances which led to the proliferation and explosion in popularity of this particular beer style. So I'm going to get the grains in now.
Yeah, so in a very basic sense, it's just very salty water.
Very hard water, but not alkaline. So London water is quite alkaline, which is one of the reasons why the paler, hoppier beers didn't work as well there. I'm just going to quickly duck off screen to grab some scissors.
Yeah, you do that. So yeah, anyway, that's just a very...
one of the reasons why the beers there weren't as good, whereas Burton water was quite high in calcium, which helped to keep the pH where it needed to be, and also with the high sulfate levels helps to really bring up the sharpness and the bitterness of the hops. So you don't need to exactly match the water, which is what me and Oscar did, or attempts to do anyway. Might not have been exact, but it was pretty damn close. But it is a good idea to make sure that those two complementary chemicals, your calcium and your sulfate, are both in high amounts in the water that you're using when you're making this sort of beer. I'm going to put the grains in. I'm using a lot of grain today. So I'm going to try my best to fit it all in. I'm using a Braumeister, which is really designed to use 5 to 6 kilos. I'm pushing 8 today. So we're going to see how we go. I've got a couple of things handy to help me achieve it. So if I don't get it done with the standard equipment, I've got some extra bits and pieces kicking around that I can utilise to get me the rest of the way.
A little hack we might show. So the Braumeister, this is the 20 litre. Let me just adjust the camera there. The 20 litre version. It normally will hold. Oh gee, I'm a bit hazy. It's like 5 to 6 kilos of grain is kind of the max you can get in there, is what it's designed for. But you can push it beyond spec.
I think with most brewing, particularly home brewing, your only limitations is your creativity and imagination. Depending on what gear you've got, you probably will be able to figure out a way to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And part of that comes down to knowledge, and part of that comes down to knowing people to ask. This shop has a fair few of them. So if you're wanting to know, like, I've got this bit of kit, I want to do a beer like this in there, and I can't figure out how to achieve it, give us a call. All the guys here sort of field those sorts of questions fairly regularly. We're always playing around with all the different gear that we stock here and figuring out ways to hack it and get the most out of it. So between the sort of 8 or 9 of us, chances are we've probably got some good ideas to kind of get you there. Another good way is join a homebrew club. Basically, more heads are better than one. So the more heads you can get onto it, the more likely somebody's got an idea. And a lot of the people that get into homebrewing are sort of engineering types.
Yeah, tinkerers by nature, I guess you could say.
And I guess engineering solutions to problems is a big part of homebrewing and brewing in general. So chances are you will find some solutions.
So I noticed there you add half the amount of grain into the Braumeister and gave it a stir, and now you're adding...
I'm going old school Greek philosophy today, so if you just keep adding half and half and half, you never actually get to the end. No, it's...
I'll take your word.
But basically, as it gets thicker, I'm adding less at a time because I want to do my best to break up any clumps which are already starting to form.
Dreaded dough balls, yep.
Yeah. So in a normal demo, this is where I'd have you guys over here doing the participation, which is basically just doing the labour for me. But also like have somebody stirring while the other one pours so that you're breaking it up as the grain goes in. A lot of breweries, like commercial breweries, will have stirred mash tuns, or they'll have some way to kind of break up the grain or agitate it as it's getting put into the mash tun for that same reason. They want to maximise the efficiency that they can get out of their mash.
Yeah.
And they don't always have the option in a commercial brewery to just stand there with a paddle and break it up and smush it against the sides.
Yeah.
So there's often like a mechanical solution to this in a commercial setting, but at home we have paddles. And these paddles are awesome actually. I bought myself one of these when we got them in. They're nice and light, they're stainless steel so they don't snap. The plastic ones are great, but they are pretty flimsy and they're very cheap. So they're under, I think they're under, I know they're under $10. They might even be less than that. But yeah, these things don't cost that much. I think they're around 20 or so.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to
Don't quote me on that.
I miss the days when we used to have those really big wooden ones. I don't know.
Yeah, the hard ones.
It got harder to find them or what, but I feel like I missed out. They were cool.
Yeah, I guess it would be a cool thing to sort of build a paddle as well. Get some hardwood and turn into things. I'm a guitarist, and I've just sort of recently become obsessed with the idea of building a guitar. And what you can get with some of the guitar building kits that you can buy is, they call it a paddle neck. So they haven't carved the head into a shape yet. It's just like a big paddle on the end of it. I'm like, I could almost get like one of those and just cut a few slots in it and use that as a mash paddle. That'd be a pretty cool crossover of brewing and guitaring. Is using a guitar neck as your mash paddle. Oh, this is going to be close, guys.
Getting close to the...
We are really going to be
the edge there.
On the edge of getting this in. So what I'm trying to do is hydrate it without spilling it over the sides of the malt pipe, because once it's hydrated it will sink down lower and I'll have more space for more grain up the top. But getting the liquid up to where I can get it hydrated is a challenge. So we've still got a bit to go. We're pretty close to the top. So this is going to be absolutely operating at the limits of the machine's capabilities today. So what I've managed to do is I've managed to create a little hole in it, which I can then push the grain down into, let the water flood up, and that's hydrating the grain. Now, I'm expecting a significant drop in efficiency today as a result of deliberately ignoring the recommendations of the device. So I'm probably thinking anywhere from sort of 65 to 70% mash efficiency. If you don't know what that means, that's okay. It's basically in an optimal, ideal laboratory situation, these grains were found to produce an amount of sugar during like the perfect mash kind of thing. So how much or how close you come to that optimal amount is what percentage of efficiency that you've managed to achieve with your mash. Normally the Brewmasters sit between 75 and 80% efficiency, which is pretty standard for most brewing systems. You can tweak them to get them a little higher. We have gotten in the 90s at work with the work kit ones, but you don't really need to. 75, 80% is about right. It's about what you want.
Yeah, so basically efficiency is a measurement of how much sugar you extract out of the grains.
And how much of the potential sugar of those grains you're extracting as well. So in a perfect scenario, you could potentially get 100%, although you can get higher than 100%.
Yeah, but that's, yeah,
enough.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Like in a perfect sort of chemically perfect mash scenario, you would achieve 100%, which is pretty unlikely. And we're probably going to be getting at about 65 to 70% efficiency today.
So there you go. Edgar actually asked that exact question, and you, I think, yeah, answered that. So 65 to 70%, Edgar. Yes, lower than normal, just because of the amount of grains that are in there. So,
we're really making it a struggle for the machine to do what it's meant to do. But that's part of the fun. Like I said, you know, part of homebrewing is coming up with ways that we can do things that our equipment or our space limitations might make otherwise sort of more challenging or might sort of be prohibitive.
And I did put the very basic recipes down in the comments if anyone's interested in having a look there.
Oh man. Yeah, I don't even know. We'll give it a go. We'll give it a go. There's only a little bit of grain left in the bag. I'm gonna have to repeat this game. I might even have to grab a bit of water from outside the malt pipe and pour it on top to help hydrate. So my plan was, my initial attempt to get this started was going to be to flip the top filter upside down to give it a little bit more space. Yep. I'm looking at this now. I don't reckon I'm going to be able to achieve that. Yep. So my second plan is we've got a false bottom, which you sort of use like a domed false bottom for like esky type mash tuns. And I'm going to take that, invert it, and put that on the top of the malt pipe. And you'll see this happen when I do it, but I'll sort of describe it whilst I'm doing the boring thing of trying to encourage water up through the grain. And then we've got a little washer, which I've got on here somewhere. That little washer is going to sit flat on top, and it's going to mean that I can then screw the wing nut down onto that and put pressure down that way. So that will hopefully give me the space I need.
Yeah, and this is a known little trick that Brewmeister uses. Have kind of developed a while back as a means of, yeah, squeezing more grain into the malt pipe. So for those of you who are interested, you'll get to see how that's done.
Yeah, there's definitely no reason why any particular type of beer you can't make on any particular type of system. You just have to adjust your expectations and adjust your approach. So if you're if you're using, say, 10 kilos of grain, you might do a double mash, which is what we do with our work kits. So put half your grain in, do a mash, pull that grain out, put the other half back into that same liquid, and do a second mash. With a bit of sparging as well. And then that way you can get significantly higher amount of stuff in.
Yep, it just adds a bit of time to the brew day, but it's a trade-off between ease versus extraction.
Yeah. And you can also use that to make double-sized batches as well.
So there you go. Once again, Edgar asked that question and answered it by default. On fire.
Just hitting the talking points. I'm got my finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
All right, I am going to grab a little bit of liquid. What I'll do is I'll tip out my just drink.
One for me, one for you.
Mm. If I had hours, I could just sort of poke around and eventually get it where I need it, but
yeah,
it's probably not the most compelling viewing.
So you are taking water from bottom and putting it back on top. So you're not adding water to the overall volume. You're just using what's there.
Yeah, just basically wetting it.
Wetting it.
Because the wet grain is going to sink down, take up less space. And that's going to free up some room to get the rest of the dry grain in. So already that is starting to pool on top, which is what we want. It means I can just kind of get this stuff hydrated a lot quicker and a lot easier. we're on the limit, guys. We're 8 kilos of grain, max Braumeister amount. And I think I've done this once before at a demo too. We did might have been the Scotch Ale, Wee Heavy that we did, or it might have been maybe the Spice Christmas beer. We definitely did a beer like this, where we had about this much grain, and we managed to get it done then, so I know we'll manage to get it done today. I
know Steve and Matt, I think, did a barley wine once. Similar situation.
Oh, they did a triple mashed barley wine type thing that ended up being around 17%, I think. They called it the big boy. They basically wanted to see how strong a beer they could make just using a mash and yeast, like no kind of distillation, no like freezing and removing, like nothing like that. They just wanted to see, just using grain and yeast and a Braumeister, how strong a beer they could make. And we got it up to about, or they got it up, I had no hand in it, I won't try to claim credit for it. They got it up to about 17%, I think. And that involved a fair bit of finagling with the fermentation as well. Lots of staggered yeast and nutrient and wort additions.
And no enzymes or anything like that? They just
I'm not sure if they used any enzymes, but it's just a fun little experiment.
Yeah.
You know, as I said earlier, we like to push the limits. We like to sort of see what we can get away with, and it's part of the fun.
So I'm sorry that you guys watching this live can't really see into the Braumeister there.
It doesn't look pretty.
Yeah, I try to avoid moving the camera too much because it just makes people seasick at home. So maybe
we're nearly there though. I can probably get the rest of the grain in on top now.
Okay, but yeah, maybe later on when we upload an edited version, I'll put in some shots of what's going on there.
There's not a lot of grain left to go in. This is all to make a beer which in no way resembles my idea of what a British IPA is either. So, well, my previous idea of what one was. So, all in the pursuit of historical accuracy, right? It does kind of also say something, I guess, about the purity of some people, or the perceived purity of some people's ideas of different beer styles of like, oh, that's not a British IPA, it's got no crystal malt in it. Well, guess what? British IPAs have been around for longer than crystal malt, so.
Yeah, interesting.
But if I was making one myself to drink, I would probably put crystal malt in it because it's delicious and it solves some problems that not having crystal malt probably would have and will cause with this beer. But
so we've got a question whether, I don't know if you'll be answering this later or not, but I'll throw it over your way. Graham's asking about the water to grain ratio on this one, which is, I guess, topical.
25 litres of water to about 8 kilos of grain. So say just under 3 to 1. Or just over 3 to 1, sorry.
Okay, that's not as excessive as I thought.
Yeah, so pretty comparable to like your standard esky type mash tun scenarios.
For a brew in a bag or a Brauermeister or a single vessel brewing system, it's quite thick, 3 to 1. Yeah. But yeah, it's by no means.
So
crazy.
I'm just going to chop it realistically because I can't stir it the way I normally would in a Brauermeister brew. I've got a thick porridge in the malt pipe effectively right now. So rather than being able to pull clumps up the top and break them up against the side, I'm just hoping if I chop it enough, I'm going to break it up enough that hopefully the water can penetrate and get through it all. And that's all I can really ask.
So as people could see, it's a little bit more work than beers with a lower amount of grain. You've got to just work a bit harder to get all the grain mixed in. Oh well, on this system anyway, if you're doing a traditional, well, it's quote unquote traditional esky style mash.
Well, if you're doing a traditional esky style mash, you're already working a little bit harder, so, so you're probably even out.
Yeah.
But I reckon. And the other thing is as well, I think if you were brewing with a friend, which I do recommend as well, just brewing with a friend is not the same as having 12 friends over while you're brewing to distract you. But if you've got like a little bit of a brewer's co-op thing going on, and you know what? I reckon I could still fit another decent chunk of grain in there if I wanted. If I wanted to. Always watch the edges of these things.
So do you want to just hold that up?
Yeah,
show what. So that's the top. So that's the mesh thingy.
It is.
It's the filter, and then in your other hand you've got the top plate.
This is the filter support. So I'm not even going to have to invert this. I'm just going to be able to.
Oh, it's going to fit the normal way. Oh, alrighty, okay.
So I could easily, I think, fit another kilo of grain in there if I really wanted to. I was a real masochist, which maybe I will one day. But yeah, we got it in. We got it reasonably hydrated. And as the pump starts working, it's going to work extra hard, being honest. I might even put a little bit more water in once I've got this hooked on, just to help loosen it up a bit, help the pump out, because the pump is going to be struggling.
We'll be working pretty hard
to push all this through. But yeah, we got it. Got it done. Stage 1 of this ridiculous brew day complete. Ridiculous brew days are fun. I really enjoy them. But yeah, I understand if all you want is to make beer. You don't want to have to work extra hard. You don't want to have to put in extra effort if you don't need to. So, not for everyone, but I remember my first decoction mash that I did was quite the day.
Yeah.
Nothing that I had planned went according to plans, and I cracked the poos at a certain point and decided to just go off and play computer games for an hour just to calm down before I came back to it. But it was one of the best beers I ever made. So
had to have a time out. Okay, cool. What style was that out of?
Czech pills.
Okay, yep, classic.
And what I'm even going to do is I'm going to push down on this to really get the liquid coming up. Which is done nicely. Get that filter plate down. And I need the crossbar, which is here. Yeah, we're sorted.
Well, colour me surprised.
I'm surprised. I was not expecting that.
I would have just used the, if I was doing that at home, I probably wouldn't even try to use the original plate.
And honestly, if I had have just left it bulging, I could have just slapped that false bottom on top without having to chop it all up.
Yeah,
Switch
right.
the pump on, it would have come up through it. But I really wanted to see if I could get it at least hydrated before we kicked off the mash. So I'm going to hit go and see what it does. So we've dropped down to 63 degrees. We were on 67, but this will heat it back up to 67. And I don't mind that because having a fairly attenuative beer isn't the worst thing in the world. I'd rather be under than over is what I'm sort of basically saying. And it is definitely moving a lot slower up towards the top of the malt pipe than it normally does, but it's moving. We have achieved mash. Yay! Can't get over that. So there'll probably be a few more grain chunks in the mash than I normally like, or in the kettle rather, in the boil. Just because my kind of rough chopping and swinging with the paddle knocked a few husks out and about down into the outside of the malt pipe, but considering what we just did, I'm really, really happy with that. We've got slowly but surely functioning mash happening in the Brewmaster. I'm gonna pop the lid on.
Cool.
So, what we have is some 60, hopefully eventually 67 degree water that has been treated with about 10 grams of calcium sulfate. And we have close to 8 kilos of marisota. And that's it. That's going to be our mash. What we're making today, realistically, by modern standards and modern categorizations, I would put closer to a barley wine than an IPA. Yeah. But as I was reading and learning, I actually found a really good article online, which is a BYO article. I'm just going to rinse this off. Which, I'm not going to lie, most of the information that I've sort of bought into today came from that article. It was really well researched and really well written. And as part of that, they had found a historical recipe from the 1800s, which was written in a way that was fairly decipherable for a modern homebrewer, which is very rare for old beer recipes. Normally it's just terms that make no sense and really strange kind of language attached to it. So
water to grain ratios are measured in hogsheads, and
and put a feather of hops into your bingle snooch, and confusing. But yeah, apparently there was enough information in there to make sense of it, and they kind of had done a historical recipe based on this one that they found. And as I was kind of looking into it, I sort of noticed that the original English IPAs kind of sat around the 10% mark, which is definitely in barley wine territory. And a lot of the IPAs that were getting made through the kind of heyday of it were sitting up over 100 IBUs, as far as people have been able to kind of piece together. So I kind of took those two numbers and met both in the middle with this recipe. So I'm kind of shooting for about 8%, and I'm shooting for just shy of 100 IBUs. And that should hopefully get me kind of a good middle ground between those early 1700s, 1800s IPAs to get a reasonable approximation of the type of beer that would have been getting made. But the recipe that I did find called for a 60-minute hop addition of 300 grams, I think it was, of East Kent Goldings.
So we're almost up near modern IPA kind of in hopping rates and IBUs.
And even in grist.
Yeah.
Like, that's the crazy thing. So like, we kind of see modern American IPAs as being so far removed from their kind of English ancestors.
And extreme and kind of pushing boundaries,
But another fact that I found is that Bass Brewing, who is kind of like the most famous producers of IPAs, like Burton Brewing Company, they were using American hops.
Huh.
At one stage, like not consistently
Cascade,
and not as a rule, but they were using quite a few American hops in the production of their IPA. So I was like, if I went back to the 1800s and like late 1800s and bought a Bass IPA, would I have been drinking something fairly comparable to modern IPAs?
Right.
Quite possible.
So American hops, so you mean like similar to the modern equivalents like Cascade and things like that?
I don't know about
we don't
Cascade,
know what the actual
but definitely
variety was?
things like Cluster probably would have been.
Yep.
I think Cluster was like the quintessential classic American hop, like the native one.
Sure.
But yeah, so who knows? It might not be as far of a departure as we kind of initially thought. I think by the time Sierra Nevada kind of started making their pale ale, your classic English pale ales and IPAs had changed a fair bit. And we will go into some of the reasons why as well,
Sure.
tax being one of them.
Yep.
It's always tax.
Yeah, it's always
economic reasons.
It is. I find that fascinating too, the influence the laws have on recipe.
The IPA predates crystal malt. So the idea that English IPAs have lots of crystal malt in them, historically, they had none.
Yeah.
Like the initial ones that were being brewed. And the idea was like they were making pale beer. So we've talked a bit definitely in my kind of pre-COVID demos, and certainly in the Munich Hallis demo that we streamed, about the importance of pale beers and these British sort of malting techniques that were producing these malts that were able to produce pale beers. And that kind of coincided with the popularity of glass being the serving implement as opposed to like stone or pewter mugs.
Ah, okay.
Because you could look at the glass and have this pale, stunning, brilliant beer.
So all of a sudden it mattered too, yeah.
And so a lot of these early pale ales were kind of just using this pale malt because they wanted to capitalize on making as pale a beer as they could, as opposed to like the browns and the porters and the darker beers that were kind of generally made and known by necessity before that sort of malting technology had kind of come to pass. Ooh. That is just moving.
Okay, so it is struggling.
Yep, I'm going to put a little bit more water in there. It is going to knock down the temperature, but like I said, I don't really mind, because these were quite highly attenuated beers as well. I just want to give it a bit more of a shot, basically. A bit more of a chance of success. So hopefully that helps it move a little bit freer. And one thing that we can do as well, if it's still really struggling, is I can pause the program, open up the malt pipe, and hopefully the enzyme activity that's going on in there now has thinned it out a little bit. So I might be able to get the paddle in there a little bit more vigorously and give it a mix up and break it up a little. Which I am going to do. Oh no, deactivation of pump, we're good. We're good.
Yeah.
Where was I? I was talking about something.
You were talking about pale malts.
Yes, yeah. So basically, these pale ales, and that effectively something which is quite interesting, which I didn't know, was that the IPA predated the pale ale, or was the pale ale, before the kind of less hoppy, less alcoholic ones became popular in the UK. Because they didn't have the same preservation requirements as the ones that were being made prior. So originally these were just called pale ales. They weren't referred to as IPAs.
As IPAs, okay. So yep.
That was kind of a later distinction to separate them from the more more popular domestic ones. So, yeah, interesting. So we are making a pale ale. We're making an English pale ale at 10% with 100 IBUs today.
Nice and acceptable.
Yeah. So yeah, 100% Marisotto malt was kind of the point. Yeah. So that kind of pretty much takes us to what's going on in the kettle, I guess. We should probably. What sort of braking regime are we having today? Are we sort of doing a?
I haven't really planned any particular, so we can just run off whatever you.
Just power straight through.
Just power straight through if you want. Yep, I'm doing my best to get the camera.
Fine with that. That is.
Keep the camera running.
Good. All right, so that explains the grist to a degree. It also explains why we're using 8 kilos of grain in an IPA recipe, in a 20-litre IPA recipe. But it's kind of impossible to talk about IPA without talking about history. And like none of the Mike?
No, you're still attached.
Oh, good.
Mike's still there. I'll check the levels in a sec.
Even just talking about putting the Burton, like the gypsum in the water, got us talking about Burton-on-Trent and that stuff. There's so much lore attached to this style of beer that you kind of... I feel kind of bad dispelling some of such a cool story, which is kind of attached to the beer, like the legend of the IPA. So I'm going to try to sort of tell the story as good as I can without trampling on that legacy too much, because I don't think it's necessarily incompatible with the reality, or at least with the reality that I've come across with sort of what research I've done. There's a fair chance that a lot of what I think and what I've read is wrong as well. That's the thing with history. You're never 100% confident on anything.
Yeah,
you can always be proven wrong, but there are sort of a few parts of the story. Or the original sort of story outlined. So basically,
Actually, speaking of breaks, I'm sorry to interrupt your flow there, Ben. I am going to just quickly throw to a break because the camera's giving me some funniness.
Okay.
Sorry guys, won't be long. Just stick in there and we'll return with some interesting history.
There's a big chunk of grain in the outside.
We're back. We've resumed. Ben is just giving the mash another stir.
I've got a solid brick of grain sitting in the malt pipe, which is all right. It was recirculating, but it was recirculating a little slow for my liking, so. But it has loosened up a lot from what it was. So I'm basically just making the most of that to get in there and give it a bit more of a mix than what I did prior. And there is definitely in the kettle, but you get that on the big jobs. Try to apply even pressure to the plate. Cool. Continue with tick. Oh, already that's crazy.
Made a difference.
Such a big difference. So before, the liquid coming up to the top of the malt pipe was like, at that time it was just like, so, and it's cascading down the sides beautifully. So definitely worth doing that.
So if you're having troubles with a stuck mash or a thick mash, a bit of a stir.
You're never locked into anything with brewing. Like you never pass the point of intervention. You can always adjust things. You can always change tack. You can always do what needs to be done to get things moving and get things happening the way that they need to happen. So I could have been like, oh no, it's going too slow. My brew day is ruined. But instead it's like, what could I do to fix that? Well, I could pause it, pull out the filter plate, get in there, break it up, and then give it another crack and see if that fixes it. If that didn't fix it, I might have put a bit more water in there. Like, there's always sort of things that you can do to kind of intervene and jump in and take charge and take control of the brew day. And that's basically all we did then. And now it's still going slow for a Braumeister brew, but it is coming up, it's cascading down the sides, things are moving, things are doing what they're supposed to do, so.
Good.
We are happy. I might even leave the lid off just so I can kind of keep an eye on it as well. But yeah, we're chugging along. We really treat these Braumeisters quite roughly.
Yeah. Yes.
We make them work, make them earn their living.
That's right.
So where were we? Breweries that were doing pale ales. Porters were still really popular at the time as well, which is actually a whole other debunking story, because the story of the porters was that the luggage porters on the trains were kind of tied into that whole history, but again, the porters predated the trains in England, so there's a bit of a hole in that story.
Right. Okay.
Porters were really popular, and pale ales were sort of starting to come up a bit. But at that time, so we're talking mid to late 1700s, the East India Company had cropped up in the sort of subcontinental Asia, and even sort of through to China as well. Like they had like quite a little racket going on there throughout Southern Asia into Asia proper. And as a result of that, there was a fair few a fair few people sort of going back and forth between India and the UK. Sort of merchants bringing back sort of the plundered goods that they were taking from India, and also bringing things back to kind of trade, sell, push on, etc. And a few of the captains of the ships that were carrying these merchants and these East India Company employees, basically, had sort of an enterprising idea of buying beer from some of the local breweries and bringing it back across to India with them. So any staff members, any kind of expats that were floating around could get on, basically have access to beer from home, effectively. So there were a few breweries that were doing it through the 1700s, through the sort of early 1700s, but there was one in particular, and it was sort of run by a dude called Hodgson. And if I get names and dates wrong, I apologise. I'm hopeless with names and dates, which is hilarious for a self-proclaimed history nerd, that I'm bad with names and dates, but forgive me if I get the names wrong. But basically, he was set up within kind of 10 k's of the docks in London. So location-wise, he was pretty well set up for the job of loading barrels of beer onto the ships. And one other thing that he was doing that no one else was offering really good lines of credit. So he would basically sell these barrels to these sailors with up to a year in advance credit, so they could not take on too much of the risk, get it back, sell it, and then when they came back into town, pay for the previous load, get a new load on credit, and kind of have that situation going. So he very quickly became the main supplier of beer to these sailors, effectively, who were kind of moonlighting as beer barons, I guess, for the East India Company back in India. Now, what's sort of not well known, I brought up porter earlier, is porter was as popular as the pale ales were in this trade as well. So a lot of porter was going to India. A lot of porter went to places like Sri Lanka, Jamaica, and Jamaica is obviously not linked to the East India Company, right, being the West Indies. But but I did a demo a while ago about tropical stout. And we covered a lot of this information in that demo, and I am working on an article that we'll be putting on the website soon as well, specifically about that, because that whole style of tropical stout kind of came about as a result of the shipping of porter into these tropical regions as well.
Porter is not a style you would associate with those kinds of climates, but there you go. What tended to be found in the porters as well as in the pale ales was, and they kind of were aware of this prior, because as early as hops were being used as a flavouring in beer, they were aware of their ability to prevent beer spoilage. Obviously, Louis Pasteur hadn't come up with germ theory yet, so they didn't know that it was antibacterial properties or anything like that. But they knew that beers that had hops in them didn't go bad as often or as quickly. Yep.
And they knew that the more hops you used, the better that effect was.
Yep.
So these were things that were known well prior to this. And as they were sort of selling different types of beer to these sailors to take over there, the ones that they tended to buy more of were the ones that were going to last that voyage. So they already had these heavily hopped, high alcohol pale ales in production. Like you could already get them from different breweries. Interestingly enough, Scotland had a lot of IPAs, and there's a theory that Scotland actually were making them earlier than England. There's certain parts in Edinburgh that have a high sulfate content in the water there as well. So they kind of fell upon that realization themselves, like independent of what was going on in England as well. So there's definitely, it's not as though they had these kind of, our idea of British Pale Ale, like these kind of low to mid strength, easy drinking, bitter but not harshly bitter.
Not harshly bitter, yeah.
Pale ales, and they just boosted everything up to get them across to India. They had these higher alcohol, higher hopped beers already, and they were just the ones that became popular for that journey for the reasons that they're kind of known for. They did start to play with that though. So there was definitely, like, as that was being sort of realised to be the more like kind of popular ones, and then like just like we see now, like when people started moving across to IPAs with the big sort of craft beer revolution, every brewer was competing for how many IBUs they could cram into their beers, and it was a similar sort of thing. Oh, they like hops. Okay, well let's see how, let's chuck heaps of them in there and really kind of go hard at it. So there was definitely an element of that that came into play, and definitely the beers got more bitter, more hoppy, and less alcoholic as well, because the early ones were, like I said earlier, about 10%. But yeah, there was, the beers already existed. They were just the ones that were chosen for the reasons of getting there in better condition. And it also changed the brewing practices as well. So they would, so like we mentioned porters before. So like with the porters, they would age them longer. So leave them in the barrels for like a year or two, so that they were more stable. So when they actually made the journey, they weren't likely to kick off another fermentation or like kind of start off again. And probably similar with the IPAs as well. Maybe they weren't aging them for quite as long, but they were definitely doing different things technically to try to avoid spoilage and avoid kind of changing character of the beers. Yeah, we'll touch on that a little bit more when we get to Burton as well, because once the sort of production shifted to Burton, there were sort of specific things that happened which kind of played into that as well. But sorry, did we have a question?
No, just actually a question from me, really. But I think I'm sure you're going to cover this anyway. I was just going to make the point or ask the question that a lot of the hallmarks of this style were born out of necessity because of the fact they had to ship them and they had to survive the journey. That's kind of that's what you're saying.
It's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. Yeah. So what it looks more like is that the style kind of existed, and that the reason why it eventually was known as the India Pale Ale was because they were the ones that were most popularly shipped there because they would make the journey.
Yep.
And when and again, we'll touch on that sort of when we get to it, like with the taxes thing. But when kind of pale ales became a lot lower alcohol and a lot more sessionable, less bitter, having the distinction of the kind of the other type, which was more bitter and more alcoholic, like throwing the India on there was kind of a way to distinguish that from the newer version.
Yeah.
It was like, these are like your India pale ales. These are the ones that you send over to India because they're
and so it's the myth that it was just a function of keeping the beers surviving the journey is not so much perhaps the truth. They were just popular because people like to drink them. And they also happened to be able to survive the journey.
And because they did survive the journey, they became really popular for that purpose as well. And again,
chicken and egg.
There's always nuance with these things.
Yeah.
So whilst that might have been the origins of it, like I think it'd be crazy to say that there wasn't a degree of that as well, like that there weren't sort of changes in the way that they were being made or like adjustments to the beers with that in mind.
Got it.
That definitely would have happened, because once it was known, there's a market for this over there, like let's make beer specifically for this purpose, then that kind of did shift most likely. But you know, we're talking 300 years, and the beers have changed so much over the course of that. And if you go back 300 years, like beers like Czech Pilsner didn't exist. So 90% of the beers currently in production in the world are variations of Pilsners and Halleses.
Yeah, these days, yeah.
And if we're looking at beer 300 years ago, those beers hadn't been invented yet. So
it's hard to imagine
the distance that that things take stylistically over the space of 100 years, let alone 3, is massive. So there are a lot of changes and a lot of developments, and they were economic, they were practical, there were all these different different things kind of impacting the progression and the development of the style over the course of that time. So it would be wrong of me to say that no, in fact, none of these things impacted the style in any way. It already existed, perfectly formed as it was before. So yeah,
there's a lot more to it than perhaps what the...
Definitely things changed,
yes.
but it was, yeah, the more bitter, more hoppy, more alcoholic pale ales were a thing before that happened. So yeah, so basically at this point in the story, we've got old mate Hodgson in London, pretty much having a monopoly on beer being shipped over to India. For the reason that he was offering great credit, he was close to the docks and everyone was liking his beer that was getting there. So he started to get a bit greedy, as tends to happen in those sorts of scenarios, especially when you've got a monopoly. So he stopped offering that credit and he started muscling out any sort of other competition. So if a brewery started selling beer, because the captains could go to anyone they wanted, basically, like they could buy beer off anyone. They were using Hodgson because of like a bunch of convenience factors, but if other breweries were trying to get in on the racket, he would just lower his prices. Because he'd had a monopoly for such a long time, he'd lower his prices and muscle them out. But it was getting to the point where he was starting to piss off a lot of people, basically. So there was a bloke called Marchbanks, spelt Marjorie Banks, but pronounced differently because it's England.
Because England, yep.
Yep. So basically, he was one of these merchant sailors, basically for the East India Company. Like he was one of the people running the ships back and forth. He had enough, so he approached a brewery in Burton. So we're at Burton now. We've made it to Burton. With some of Hodgson's beer and sort of said, "Oi, can you make something like this? If you can, we'll buy heaps of it off you and we'll start shipping it across." So he got his brewer onto it. I can't remember that. This is where I said the names and the dates thing's going to come into play. I can't remember the name of this particular brewery or the brewer. But basically, he got his brewer onto it and they made a beer resembling that. And unbeknownst to them, because of the previously mentioned water qualities that they had in Burton-on-Trent, the beer was phenomenal. Like it far exceeded the qualities of the beer that was being made in London with far less suitable water.
Yeah, right.
When that kind of got out, very quickly, our friend Hodgson lost a lot of his business and kind of fell away and was no longer the go-to for the sort of hoppy, alcoholic pale ales that were getting shipped overseas to India and around, like I mentioned earlier. This was about the time that train lines.
Yes.
I think that was a little bit later because that was really where Bass Brewing got its big boost.
Okay.
There's a bit of alliteration for you.
Bass Brewing got a boost. Yep.
But the popularity of the style in England grew quite a lot at that time as well, as a result of having access to it. And it wasn't too far before they started to figure out ways to mimic the water as well. So they were able to have Burton type water Once they realised that was what was at play, they kind of figured out how to change the water quality, which is something that I think all brewers today, home or commercial, really benefit from as well. I think if you're making a style of beer, getting the water profile right is a really critical component of that. Beer, like water, makes up minimum 90% of your beer. So if you've got the wrong type of water, then you're not going to get the right type of beer. So yeah, moved to Burton. A few breweries got quite popular, and then Bass Brewing, which I think most people have heard of Bass. You can still buy Bass beer, but it's not so many bees. So really little bit.
You're doing well.
You can still buy it, but it's no longer owned by the original company. I think it's AB InBev.
Oh, well, that makes
owns
sense.
it now.
Yeah, sure, one of the big ones.
Or yeah, I'm pretty sure it's AB InBev, not Miller Coors. Own it now, but
And they still make it under the Bass label? It's still... Yeah,
I think
right.
so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think you can still go out and buy a Bass IPA. It's going to be very different to what you would have bought in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But you can definitely still go out and buy a Bass IPA. It's just not the same company as what it was when it started, and became the biggest beer company in the world at the time. Largely through a combination of exports, and when Bass came on board was when those train lines came into play. So it was just really good timing on their part. They had this great product. They had a means by which to transport it around the country to London, to York, to Kent, to wherever they needed to transport it to around England. And I mentioned earlier as well, the glassware was becoming really popular. So you had this brilliantly pale beer that everyone wanted to look into their glass. So people were buying the pale beers for the novelty of it. The water quality was brilliant. So the flavors of this beer, like once you got past the novelty factor of the pale beer in the clear glass, you had the really awesome flavor as well. And then they had the transport arrangement of being able to get the beer fresh to different pubs and inns all throughout the country. So one of the things which came out at about the same time that this was all exploding, so we're kind of, forget India at this point. Like, the India story is done.
Okay, yep, right.
I could talk about the East India Company and all the atrocities and horrible things that they did, but that's not what this stream is about. It's a horrible piece of history.
And they built the railway system in America too at the time. Was that them? And there was
they had their hands in a lot of things, but particularly like with India, like so many of the problems that India now faces can be traced right back to the East India Company. Basically kicked most of that off, and then the Crown sort of picked up where they left off and carried that through. But yeah, so we are effectively just going to be focusing on England now for the rest of the story.
Okay, so we're back in England.
We're back in England. We're in Burton, and these beers are becoming really, really popular. In order to increase the stability of the beers, they wanted to be able to attenuate them as well as possible. So that basically meant, it's kind of counterintuitive to most English yeasts. So most English yeasts are really flocculent. They drop right out, so they finish clear, and you can generally like crop the yeast off the top, throw them in the next one, and kind of keep the process going that way. So in Burton, what they wanted was a yeast that was powdery and low flocculation, so that it would attenuate to a higher degree. You'd chew through more of the available sugars in the beer, get a more finished beer, so that when you're transporting it, there's no risk of it kicking off more fermentation or changing character or turning into a different thing than what they were sending out of the brewery. So they created what is called a Burton Union system. Now, I'm a musician. I say this in most streams because I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist. I don't fully understand the whole way that it works. But effectively, it was a system where the beer would blow off through a tube into a separate vessel with the yeast. and then settle out and separate, and they were able to then put the beer without the yeast back into the vessel, clear and fully attenuated. So like it's, like I said, I don't fully understand the way that it works. All I know is that it was a way for them to use a higher attenuating, lower flocculating yeast strain without it being a murky, yeasty mess.
Yeah. Read New England IPA.
Yeah, and it was really effective. And that was, again, another one of those factors that really helped Bass to cement themselves as as the big player when it came to pale ales and IPAs as we know them now. I don't know, actually, in my research, I wasn't able to find out the point at which they started being referred to as IPAs.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't know if they already were at this stage, or if there was like, I definitely know that Bass was one of the breweries that coined the term.
Okay.
Or like you could buy a Bass IPA, and that was kind of became synonymous with the brewery.
Yep.
But I don't know at what point that terminology came into play.
So you don't know if it was maybe a marketing kind of thing, or perhaps it was just something that was born out of...
And to be honest, it didn't occur to me to look that up until right that second when I was talking. I'm like, oh, that would have been a good thing to Google, wouldn't it?
Oh, well.
And honestly, it probably would just be a Google and you'd find out really quickly.
If only there was some kind of machine you could use to look this stuff up.
Yeah, although always be wary of what you find.
Yeah, there's that too.
IPA was a term coined by Brian India in...
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
So what, I know you said you're not great with dates. What roughly kind of what?
We're in the 1800s.
1800s.
Yeah, so sort of pushing towards the mid 1800s at this stage. So like probably 1830s, 1840s.
Yep.
And again, I could be completely wrong, but that's kind of where roughly my headcanon is sitting in, like in terms of the progression of the story and where it starts and where it finishes.
All right.
So at about, well, let's jump to the next point. So let's say mid to late 1800s, the taxation laws in England had shifted. So basically what was happening was you were getting taxed on the specific gravity of your wort, and you had to pay the tax at that point before it went into your fermenters. So it was effectively a double tax. As a result of that, brewers all over England almost instantly were working on ways to lower the gravity of their beers, while still having the flavour that they were chasing. So that's where crystal malt becomes a huge component of a lot of British beer styles. You've gone from having sort of, at this point, IPAs would have been sitting around 7% probably, 7 or 8%. And they very quickly dropped down to 5 or 6.
Right.
Pale ales down to like 3 or 4. So you're trying to find a way to maintain the flavour, the body, all those things in a significantly lower alcohol, lower gravity product. So something like crystal malt, which lends a lot of body, a lot of dextrins, a lot of kind of mouthfeel and richness to the beer, was very useful in that. So again, I don't know exactly when crystal malt was invented, when it was developed, but it would have been around that time. I know that it wasn't a thing in the 1700s when these beers were sort of first getting made.
Yep.
So it kind of makes sense that it would have played into that a lot. If it wasn't already invented, that's a pretty powerful motivator to start working on something.
Save money on tax, so let's invent something that helps us get around it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's also a point where having those super highly attenuated beers, it was handy in terms of pushing alcohol content into a low gravity beer. But it's also got diminishing returns in terms of having a full-bodied beer at the end of the day if you're starting with a lower gravity. So
starting with lower gravity, it thins out the beer because it eats through more of the sugars than you want, and
yeah. So there was probably like at that point, and again, like I'm kind of speculating, but I would imagine at that point you would have had the two schools of thought of people who were wanting to maintain the higher attenuation so that you could get the people drunk with the lower gravity beers, but then you also would have had the kind of chasing the mouthfeel and the flavour sort of school of thought, where maybe we need to be looking at a more flocculent, less attenuative yeast strain, so that we can maintain a few of the sugars and a bit of the mouthfeel in the beer, and kind of give people a more sort of substantive drinking experience. If what they were used to was sort of 7, 8, 9, 10% beers at that point, dropping right down to your standard pub ale being a 3-4% thing, would have been quite a change in people's understanding of going to the pub for a beer. So yeah, that was definitely a big player, and that's kind of where the pale ale comes in as well. So what we now refer to as like your ordinary bitters.
Yep.
Which anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5%, I think, is kind of roughly the range.
Okay.
Or 3 to 4, it's somewhere around there.
Yep.
I would fail my BJCP exam if I pushed out those numbers right now. But it's been a while since I looked at the vital stats. But down low, basically, around the 3s is where you're looking at for your ordinary bitter. That became really like the most popular beer around England, and again, you're talking about a pale, bitter, heavily hopped, Burtonized, kind of dry, sulfite-driven pale ale. Effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if there was any kickback when they changed that, when there was a transition between going from these big hoppy beers that people were used to down to these smaller beers. The only reason I think that is back when VB tried to change their recipe by 0.2% alcohol points or something. There was an uproar.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know, I guess. I'm sure there was, but I guess as well, like, we're talking about England, like, they've got gin. At this stage,
there's always something else.
And gin became a real problem in England as well.
Right.
Again, bad with years, so I apologise, but gin kind of came to England out of a war that they fought with the Dutch against the Spanish. So when they went to Holland, Holland has a spirit called Geneva, which is it's a pot distilled malt spirit flavoured with juniper.
Right.
And the English referred to it, funnily enough, as Dutch courage.
Oh, okay.
Going into battle, and they became so enamoured with it that when they came back, they worked on creating their own version. And your kind of classic London dry gin is their variation of it. So if you can get Geneva at Dan Murphy's. Bowls is, I think, to this day the oldest running distillery,
right,
or one of. You buy it in this like clay bottle, which is really, I've got one at home. I love the stuff. I think it's
I'm gonna have to try it.
It's kind of somewhere between a whiskey and a gin, because it's a pot distilled malt spirit, so you get a lot of the maltiness coming across in it. But it also is distilled with the botanicals as well, namely juniper. So it has gin characteristics, but it's also like a bit richer, a bit maltier, a bit more sort of full in the mouthfeel. Cool. Really, really tasty stuff. Whereas what they were doing in England was basically in classic sort of English fashion, trying to get the most out of what you got. They were using column stills to basically get a really dry, like over 90% base spirit, watering that down, adding your botanicals, and then running it through that way. So that's where the term London dry gin comes from, because it's significantly drier than the malty, smooth, rich Geneva.
All right.
So there's a bit of gin history. I'm a bit of a gin obsessed person as well.
I like my gin too. I have not ever made it, but yeah.
And we also have an article on that floating around somewhere. I don't know if it's on the website, but we released an article on making gin in the newsletter a little while ago. So if you wanted to get a copy of that, just email us and we can arrange to get that out to you as well. So yeah, but I imagine it would have been definitely England had gin at that point. Let's put it that way.
Okay,
I wasn't prepared to go on a gin tangent, so I would have.
I think I derailed you a bit there.
Oh no, it's yeah. I'm just getting a bit dry because I haven't had any water, but it would have, in terms of the timeline of when column stills became common and popular, the gin thing would have had to have come after that point, like the London dry gin thing. So I don't know exactly what century we're talking, but I feel like it would have been later, so like at least 1700s, maybe later. I could be wrong.
Okay.
I could definitely be wrong because I've been wrong before.
No.
But yeah, I'm feeling like it would have been 1700s or later. So wouldn't surprise me if the lower beers came on and that was just like a
Crutch.
a thirst quencher, and they got on the gins.
Yeah, right, got it.
Out.
Yeah.
English drinking culture is interesting, actually. My uncle sort of is from Birmingham originally, and he sort of said because he came over when he was like 14, 15, and when he went back over and he went out for a night with his old schoolmates, and they're drinking like vodka Red Bulls and ciders and all the rest of it as pre-drinks because it's about the maximum amount of alcohol with the easiest drinking.
Yeah.
Like the Australian drinking culture has this real like, oh, men have got to drink beer and things like that. It's starting to shift now, but
yeah,
there isn't that kind of really gendered sort of you got to have a manly drink thing. It's just like, oh, vodka Red Bull, that's easy to drink. Or
I think it depends, doesn't it? I know, yeah, with the those alco pop style drinks that sort of were really popular, probably a decade ago now, there was a real problem with them over here. But yeah, anyway, it's all interesting.
It's all a bit silly. Just drink beer because it tastes good.
Yeah, exactly. So how are you going there? Did you need a drink?
I'm going to grab a little bit of water just because I've started getting a bit of a dry throat, and I don't want people thinking I'm patient zero over here.
Just to note, Ben is an asthmatic as well, so you do struggle a bit in the mask, and talking for this long is it's taxing on the larynx.
It is something I'm uniquely gifted at, though. I can talk for hours and hours and hours without really saying anything. Did you want to take a break to do that, or you want to scrap yourself a bit of water? All right, we'll keep rolling. 41 of 60 minutes of the mash have gone through, and we don't really need to go through the whole brew today. It's probably more of a history stream than a brewing stream, really. But I mean, we can do whatever chat wants, basically. If chat wants to go deeper into the actual brewing process and look at sort of what's going on there, then I'm happy to do that too.
All right. Well, yeah. So, what do you guys think? If anyone out there has any specific questions, we did have one earlier, which I'll throw over to you. But I think Ben's intention today, is to talk about the historical aspects of this particular style more than anything, and give you a bit of context, because really it's a pretty simple, as far as process goes. It's if you know how to brew a beer, it's pretty straightforward. The recipe is in the comments below. If you're interested in having a look, I will upload a more comprehensive, where I think Ben's slowly getting the recipes on our website for these beers, and they'll be quite a comprehensive sort of listing there.
I went through all the previous demos the other day and I got to something like 30 different ones.
So there's a lot you've got to do.
And annoyingly, all of my recipes got wiped off the system, so
yes.
I'm kind of having to build them all up again from scratch. But we're gradually getting there. I've started work on the tropical stout, so that'll hopefully be done soonish, and then just kind of gradually poke my way through the rest of them.
So on a technical note, earlier Graham Smith was asking about pH, mash pH, and just I guess how important that is for this particular style. If there's anything there.
So I am basically approaching it like I would any beer where pH wasn't a huge issue. Yeah. So I'm kind of shooting for 5.3. I haven't tested it. I'm not super stressed. I know that I'm going to be pretty well in the ballpark.
So yeah.
Historically, they wouldn't have been testing pH and things like that. So I feel like if you've got plenty of calcium sulfate in your water, you're going to kind of
there's plenty of
be about where you need to be for
it's not
this kind of thing. If you want an accurate recreation of what they would have been drinking.
So you could, of course, take your pH readings if you're the kind of brewer likes to be precise, but the grain is not super light, it's not super dark, being Marisota, and all the salts in there probably.
There's lots of Marisota in there. There's lots of calcium sulfate in there. So between those two, we should be pretty good. If I was being really kind of finicky with it, I would, I didn't actually, I thought this was next week, so I wasn't as prepared for it as I was hoping I was going to be. What I normally do is I'll punch out like a water report and calculate sort of if I need to add acid or things like that to the water. And I recommend doing that with any beer you're brewing, basically. If you've got sort of access to that information and sort of a head to do it. But yeah, if you shoot for 5.3 to the best of your ability, you should be standard. Pretty good.
Standard thing. Cool.
I do want to talk as well about the kind of modern idea of what an English IPA is and how to go about making one of those too, because it's quite different to what we're doing today. We're making what is probably better described in modern terms as a barley wine. It's almost like a hybrid between an American and an English style barley wine, but with no crystal malt. So it's a very interesting thing that we're doing today. But this is the first time I've brewed an English beer, really, for a long time, without sort of doing my standard English beer, or English pale ale, I should say. Standard English pale ale grist, which is 95% Marisota, 5% crystal malt. That's any pale ale, whether it's an ESB, an IPA, a ordinary bitter, that's my go-to. And generally medium crystal. Sometimes I'll play around, like use some lighter and some darker ones, depending on what sort of flavors I'm chasing, but I always keep it at 5%, 95% Marisota, and that's just locked in. That was what the head brewer at Fuller's, on an episode of the Brewing Network with Jamil, said all their beers are that ratio, or all of their kind of like their London Pride, their ESB, their Golden Pride, it's all the same mash, it's all that ratio. And since I've been doing that, I'm getting exactly what I want out of my English beers, and it's just sort of focusing on hopping and on the yeast management side of things. That gets me the rest of the way there. This beer I've not put any crystal malt in, so it's pretty unusual, because before I went to 5%, I got as high as 20% crystal malt in my English style beers. Yeah. Chasing that rich caramelly kind of thing. Yeah. And I think a part of that is as well, English beers by the time they get here, they've often become a bit oxidized. So that really highlights the caramel flavors a lot. Yep. So the perception of a lot of English beers by the time they've gotten here is more caramelly than they actually probably were when they were fresh. So yeah, when I was chasing the flavor of Fuller's ESB from a bottle, I was going really high with the caramel malt percentage. Okay. Probably too high.
Too high, right? Yep.
So that 5% is coming down, not going up, from my initial thing. So it is a little bit weird. So if I was to brew an English IPA based on the BJCP descriptions of what an English IPA should be, it would be significantly less grain. I'd probably be shooting for about 6%, I think. So maybe 5.5, 6 kilos of grain. 95% of that grain I would be using Marisota, and 5% I'd be looking at like some kind of British medium crystal. I think it's really important when you brew British beers to use British malts, because they have a very unique character to them.
Okay, so Simpson's is the one we stock?
Particularly the crystal malts.
Yep.
That being said, Australian crystal malts follow pretty closely to the English in terms of how they're made. So that like, if you have an Australian medium crystal, it's closer to an English medium crystal than to like, say like a German Karamunic or something like that. Like it's going to be closer to an English one. So if we were out of stock of Simpson's medium crystal and you're looking for another crystal malt of the same colour, go the Australian ones.
Okay, so yep, that's a good substitute.
And Joe White Ale is actually quite a good base malt. It's not going to be the same. Like Marisotto has such a nutty, biscuity character to it. Yeah. You're not going to get exactly the same character, but if you're really pushed, the Joe White Ale has quite a rich flavour to it, and you'll get a serviceable beer.
Yeah, I do find it has a sweetness to it somehow.
Yeah,
I don't know
it's
how
sweet,
to describe
it's rich, it's taken a bit dark. It's actually taken a bit darker than the Marisotto as well, so it's got a few more of those sort of melanoidins going on in there. Gives you a bit of a boost to your beer, but you just don't have that nuttiness. So in that instance, maybe look at something like some amber malt, some biscuit malt, along with the crystal to give it a little bit more of that character, of that nutty character, that biscuity character. You can even use, we mentioned in the NEPA stream, Golden Naked Oats.
Right. Yep. Okay.
So Golden Naked Oats have a real kind of nutty, biscuity, almost sesame snaps kind of character to them, and a little bit of that in the context of the beer would really go a long way as well. And I would, even though Golden Naked Oats are a crystal malt, I would use that on top of the 5% crystal that you're using, just to give it that extra kind of nutty, biscuity.
Get it more in the Maris Otter direction.
But if we've got it, use Marisotto or Golden Promise. Both are UK malts, both made from UK barley and malted in a sort of British kind of way. So that would be what I would be aiming at. So yeah, so 95% ideally English-based malt, if not as nutty as you can get it, and 5% English crystal malt, if not go Australian. And shoot for around 50 or 60 IBUs of bitterness using British hops. So Target's a really good bittering hop for these beers. It's got like a good clean bitterness, but it's also slightly higher alpha than your Goldings and your Fuggles. Which means that you are using less of it to achieve the same bitterness. And then things like your Goldings, your Fuggles, your Target, Styrian Goldings as well is really nice. So East Kent or Styrian Goldings and Fuggles are kind of the three main character hops I would use. Probably in like a 5 or 10 minute edition to give it a big boost of flavour. And you definitely want to dry hop your English beers. Something we didn't touch on before, but so when we were kind of touching on how there's a lot of similarities between the English and the modern American ones, more so than a lot of people think, dry hopping is an English technique. The idea being that you're injecting a big boost of hop flavour and aroma into the beer closer to serving. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, you can still get them from some places, hop plugs.
Yeah, they were more of a thing.
They're kind of not quite a pellet, but they're not quite a cone. It's like a compressed hop leaf thing in a specific shape and size.
Yeah.
Now that shape and size is the exact shape and size needed to push into the bunghole of a cask. Hop plugs were specifically designed for dry hopping. So the idea is you open up the bunghole, push the plug down into that bunghole and then close it up again. And you're getting a big burst of fresh hoppy flavour for people to enjoy. So yeah, we're literally like, your early IPAs, you're literally talking about no crystal malt, just base malt, heaps and heaps of hops, up over 100 IBUs, and then a big, decent dry hop as well to give you that extra burst of flavour. So really similar to
very similar to what we do today.
What modern IPAs are. With the exception, And I mean, we mentioned earlier, Bass was using some American hops, but you are talking more about grassy, herbal, spicy, floral kind of characters rather than your fruity, citrusy, piney American characteristics. So I would definitely dry hop. I probably wouldn't double dry hop, which is kind of the rage now with the Neepers, but definitely get a decent whack of some Styrian Golding, some Fuggles or some EKG in a few days before you package to give you the fresh cut grass, cinnamony spice, floral kind of character into your beer. So when you're pouring it, it has that fresh hop character along with the bitterness is really crucial. And that's pretty much how I would approach making a wort for a modern English IPA.
Yep.
Like according to BJCP sort of guidelines.
Which is probably what we all think of when we think of a British IPA. That's what
absolutely.
people would normally
and
think.
For a good reason, because like I said, like the beer has become that over the last 300 years.
For a reason.
So it's what we mean now when we say English IPA is that.
Yep.
It's not whatever the hell I'm doing.
Hoppy barley wine.
Yeah, hoppy barley wine. Hoppy barley wine. Hoppy barley wine. That would be the approach that I would take. In terms of fermentation, because fermentation is important. Got a bunch of different options, really, don't you? And so, like there's lots of ways you can go. You can probably tell I'm a bit of a fan of Fullers. I really like Fullers.
I know this about you.
The 1968 Y yeast is unofficially the Fuller's strain. So that's kind of my go-to English beer yeast. When I first started playing around with making English beers, that was the one that I used because I wanted to make them taste like Fuller's because I loved Fuller's. And then because I became really familiar with that yeast, I got used to working with it. I knew sort of how to treat it to get it to do what I wanted it to do. I've just kind of kept going with that. So that's the yeast that I'm comfortable working with. That's the yeast that I continue working with. And I think everybody's going to find a similar thing. Whenever you use a new yeast, it's probably going to take you a few brews to figure out what that yeast likes, how it likes to be treated, the sort of temperature ranges you want to work at, what sort of fermentation regime in terms of temperatures and things that you want to use with it. Starters, things like that. Like every yeast has got its kind of idiosyncrasies and its kind of quirks, and getting to know what those are and working with them is really important part of making the best beer you can with that yeast. So whichever yeast you become familiar with and you get used to working with is probably going to be the one that you'll go with 9 times out of 10. So if you've already been brewing English beers, you've got a few yeasts that you like to work with, go with one of them and you'll be fine. You'll get a good result. You do want a cleaner finish on a British IPA than you do on a British Pale Ale. It's not an ester-driven beer. It's not a yeast sort of driven thing. So as we said before, like for a long time they were trying to really heavily attenuate these beers and make them really clean and dry and quite alcoholic as well. So I know that the Whitbread yeast is quite popular for a lot of people.
Okay.
Which is 10.99, I think. 10.98, 10.99, somewhere around there. Fuller's yeast is fine. It's probably not going to be as attenuative, so it won't dry out as much.
I was going to ask. Is that people report it finishing quite sweet? Is that something that you know how to work around, or you just roll with it?
It's something that you can probably still use to good effect in a modern example, because I think most judges, if it's got English beer characters and it sort of has, even if it is a little under attenuated, like the thing that most people think of when they think of English IPAs these days is like a fuller, heavier, more bitter pale ale. Yeah. Like another step up from ESB sort of thing. Yeah. So I think you'd be fine if it wasn't quite as attenuated now. 1469 would be an interesting one to play with. That's the, again, unofficially the Samuel Smiths. Okay. The West Yorkshire. ale. And Sam Smith's is a classic English pale ale. And it does attenuate a little bit better than the 1968. So that might be a really good option if you wanted to have a nice, dry, clean finishing English beer.
Cool.
Down Star Nottingham would probably be really good as well.
Noddy, yeah, sure, yeah.
Because it does a really good job of chewing through things. But what you definitely do want to do is use lots of it.
Okay.
Make sure it's really healthy. And you want to ferment in the lower end of the range. So I would keep it under 20 degrees.
Right.
For this fermentation. I tend to anyway.
Yeah.
But I would probably be fermenting around 17,
Right.
18 for
Okay,
this.
17, 18, okay.
Which is kind of my standard, I want a clean ale.
Yes, okay.
Fermentation.
So you're suppressing those esters a little bit in favouring clean fermentation.
And it gives you headspace as well. So if you're fermenting at 17, 18 and it starts to slow down or get a bit sluggish, you've still got a few degrees to push into it to help
You can towards the end.
nudge it along towards the end without it getting sort of too far into intense esters and spice territory.
Yep.
So you can still keep it under 20 degrees, but have a few degrees of headspace to sort of
raise it up a degree or two just towards the end of
help
fermentation.
nudge the yeast along, which a lot of English yeast needs that. You do need to baby it a little bit. The kind of, I heard it put one way, which is like 17 to 20, then hold it steady. So pitch at 17, rise it up to 20 and hold it there.
Yeah, got it. Yep.
Doesn't work for all yeasts, but it is sort of a good way to think about fermentation with a lot of these strains, because with a lot of them being so flocculent, they have an inclination to drop out, and they'll often drop out before the job's done. So if you're kind of actively on the fermentation, monitoring it, keeping an eye on it, when it does start to slow down, you can give it a bit more heat, sort of help the yeast pick up again, keep it active, keep it awake, so that it will attenuate those extra few points out for you. Because once it's down the bottom, you're going to be struggling to get it back in again.
Yeah, then you got to do all kinds of things like stir it and
and
rouse
even
it.
when you do that, that's not a guaranteed fix for a lot of English yeast.
Yeah,
A lot of English yeast is like, oh, there's a little bit of alcohol in here now. I've lost momentum. I'm not getting back up again. I'm done.
I'm done.
So it's better to be on the yeast and kind of help it get the job done than to try to fix it if it does stall or drop out.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a modern approach, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
To brewing this beer.
This beer that you're brewing now, being so big, is this something you would age?
Yes.
Yep.
So, and that's another thing as well. So we're talking about early 1700s, late 1600s even. There's no refrigeration at this point. So even the hops themselves that are going into this beer, they've been stored unrefrigerated. Who knows how much alpha acid they had packed into them when they were getting thrown into these beers.
Yeah. Probably
they're
quite
also being
cardboardy and who knows.
Being then put into barrels and stored and then shipped overseas for however many months it took to get from England to India. I don't know. I don't know the route they took. So by the time they were getting drank, and obviously that changes once it sort of shifts to England because they're getting drank a lot fresher, but like these ones, by the time they were getting drank, like you're talking months.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of that bitterness is probably rolled off by that point. A lot of the sort of the freshness of the dry hop has probably lost a bit of its kick as well.
Being sloshed around in a barrel on a boat too would introduce a fair amount of oxygen.
Oxygen and different microbes as well. So you're probably talking about a few different Brett strains kicking around in there as well. You're definitely talking about a beer that's at least a little bit aged. So if you were going to make this type, treating it like a barley wine is probably not the worst idea, or even like a lager. Like giving it some time in cold storage before you actually start drinking it. If you wanted to keep it stable and keep its fermented character, letting it sort of sit cold for a little while, like a month or two before you hone into it, might help. But yeah, if you wanted the authentic drinking experience, chuck it in an oak barrel, slosh it around.
Keep it in the garage through summer.
We'll take it down the beach and just slosh it around with the sea air getting into it. Give it a few months and then have a crack at it, and you'd probably be closer to what they were drinking, definitely in India and probably in a lot of parts of the UK as well, before the trains system kind of came into play. Yeah. It's John actually, John, the owner of the business, mentioned to me, he says, make sure you talk about the fact that like the hops are probably long gone by the time anybody actually drank these things. I'm like, yeah, that's a really good point. Like ignoring even the journey, like the fact that like how long had they had those hops sitting around, picked and dried and
prior to even
unrefrigerated for before they put them in.
Yeah.
They didn't have vacuum seals back then either, so.
Nope. And I guess there would have been no dry hopping at their destination in India or any of these places.
I don't know, actually.
It's
It's a good question.
To freshen them up. But,
there definitely was in England. So like again, those hot plugs, like the casks get delivered to the pubs and the beers effectively get finished at the pub. So
yeah, right.
They take them through that last stage of conditioning, probably chuck in a hot plug into the cask to give it fast first, and then hook it up when it's ready. Hook it up to the beer pumps and pump it upstairs with the vacuum pumps and.
Yeah, right, and then do the.
So yeah, definitely very different drinking experience in England than what it would have been in India.
Yeah, something interesting to think about. Yeah. We have a Braumeister related question actually that's just popped up. It's a little unrelated to the history, but just basically Paul's asking, I guess in this size Braumeister, which is the 20 litre, can you do a small batch, a 5 litre batch in it? I'm not sure off the top of my head actually, how low you can get. I think it might be a bit low.
Because you can get the short malt pipe, which takes you down to a 10 litre brew size.
Oh, okay.
And I guess that could potentially finish you with a 5 litre brew, realistically.
Yeah.
So by the time you sort of take into account evaporation, the sludge at the end of fermentation as well, like what you're actually getting out.
Yeah.
The fermenter at the other end would probably, you could definitely shoot for a 6 or 7 litre end product, realistically, from a 10 litre brew length.
So what Ben's saying, Paul, is perhaps make your final batch size a little larger, so you'd be up around 8 litres or so anyway. Then by the time it gets in your fermenter, and then at the end of the day, well, it depends on, I guess, what you're wanting. If you're wanting if you only have a 5 litre demijohn, maybe that'll limit you a bit. But Steve is off camera, actually. Steve, do you know what's the smallest batch size you can make on a Braumeister? If you wanted to really make it a 5 litre, is that something achievable, or is that below the?
No, standard you want to get the short malt pipe.
Yep.
Because of the upflow.
Yes, right. Yeah, so you need a certain amount. Yeah.
Set it down, so you have to go to the short malt pipe.
Short malt pipe.
It's fairly set in
what you can do. Yeah. So you'll need to buy.
You can definitely do an extended boil as well.
Yep.
So if you were doing a 10 litre brew on with the short malt pipe and the 20 litre brow, if you still had too much liquid or more than you wanted, you could just extend the boil. Maybe throw the hops in half an hour into your boil. I think another thing worth being careful of is boiling it below the elements.
Yeah.
You don't want to cook your elements and dry them out either. So you want to have at least enough liquid to cover them.
Yeah, and there's a bit of dead space in the bottom as well. You got a few litres you lose there. Yeah. So it can be doable with a few tricks. I hope that answers your question, Paul. That's a bit of a long-winded answer, but where there's a will, there's a way.
I mean, one thing you can do is just effectively. Actually, no, I probably wouldn't. I was just sort of had an idea pop into my head, and then when I started to piece it together in my brain, I'm like, no, that won't work. So let's just pretend I never had that idea.
It's once you start getting into those really small volumes, it does become tricky. I mean, Speed'll do make a 10 litre Braumeister, a little mini one, and in that you absolutely could. So, I mean, if you're just looking to do small batches and that's going to be a thing going forward, you could just buy one of the 10 litre Braumeisters, the little baby ones. But then, of course, if you then expand later down the track, you're limited to 10-litre batches.
Yeah. I mean, 5 litre, you could realistically do that with probably your standard kitchen pots and pans.
Yeah, just to do a brew in a bag on the kitchen stove. I think you're getting into
I've
the
done that
territory.
before.
Yeah, same. Yeah, just buy a 10-litre pot or something, and
you do have some limitations in terms of flavours at that scale. It can be hard to kind of separate everything out, but it's doable.
Yeah. Well, apart from that, the chat is fairly quiet, so I assume that means they're just listening to you. Yeah.
I'm kind of can't sort of think too much about much else to cover, I guess.
Okay.
I mean, we can talk about. It's a pretty straightforward brew
Yeah,
today.
yeah. So
we've mashed at 67 degrees, which is kind of splitting the difference between the alpha and the beta amylase. So we're getting the dual enzyme action. Should give us like the most run-of-the-mill, down the line, effective mash.
yeah. So everything's pretty much bog standard except for the obviously the amount of grain you're using and the hops.
Yeah.
But
so that is something worth touching on. So I've got 250 grams of hops. Of East Kent Goldings, which is a lot. So the recipe I found called for, I think, 500 grams, maybe 300. It was a lot, even more than this. I'm not even going to put all of this in at the 60 minutes like the recipe called for. I'm going to roughly put half in. I'm not going to measure too carefully because I'm not really that phased by that. My research said up to over 100 IBUs. So if I go a little bit over, I'm not that worried.
Yep.
I'll put about half in at 60 minutes, and I'll put the other half in about 10 minutes to go.
okay.
Just to give it a bit more flavour. And when this is fermented, we've just gone with East Kent Goldings for this one. You could go with that again, or
Classic
you could go with
English
like
hop.
some Styrian Goldings, some Fuggles, just if you wanted to make it a bit more complex. And just dry hop, probably with anywhere from 40 to 80 grams per litre. Not per litre, that's a lot. You'll end up with no liquid. Probably anywhere between 40 to 80 grams. I'd probably lean on the 80 gram side of like a Fuggles or a Styrian or something like that, just to give it that burst of fresh hop flavour. Before you get it packaged and start serving it.
And these aren't super high alpha hops either, so you're not getting
5% alpha, so I think the recipe ended up being around, what did it say? It estimates 90 IBUs.
Okay, so it's up there. Yeah, that's just the sheer amount.
Yeah, decently bitter. But like I said, if I end up pushing over 100, that's still historically accurate, so I'm not that phased. And what tended to happen was as the alcohol percentage dropped, the bitterness went up.
Interesting.
Because that was like at that point, like thinking about preservation.
You're right. Yes, so the alcohol wasn't doing the job.
Alcohol's a great preserver. As the alcohol started to slowly lower, they were putting more hops in to achieve the same sort of preservative effects.
Yep.
One thing I found out, which I didn't know when I was reading about this, is that they weren't talking about isomerized alpha acids back in the day, but they were talking about how much of a preserving effect different hops had on your beer.
Yep.
So nowadays, like we buy hops and we look at the alpha acids because we're thinking about IBUs, which is a measurement of the total amount of isomerized alpha acids in a specific volume of solution. Isomerized meaning the alpha acids have been boiled and turned into a more soluble form, so that it stays in the beer and makes it bitter for a long period of time. They were buying them based on how well they would preserve the beer.
So they knew this certain variety A of a certain hop would extend the beer's life for a certain period, and variety B would maybe not be so good, so they would go for the hop they knew preserved.
And it was like a combination of like how much of like a different amount of alpha and beta acids and a few other things the hops contained in them was how they came to that kind of calculation.
Yeah.
So you get the hops, or you'd use the hops based on the preservative qualities that those hops had and how long you were planning on preserving it for, sort of thing.
We have a question that has come through, which actually, come to think of it, is quite, it's probably a good point with this style of beer in particular, but I think Garth may be just asking in general too about oak. Just tips or tricks using oak, chips, spirals, or small barrels. And I guess this beer, to bring it into context with this beer, would have had an oaky quality, I assume, because it would have been
Probably.
shipping barrels.
I don't know if they would have pitched the barrels that they were shipping it in. So if they pitched the barrels, then no, it wouldn't have had an oaky quality.
Yeah.
But if they didn't, then yeah, it absolutely would have. In terms of how you would add oak, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, and each have their pros and cons.
Yep.
Chips are fast and efficient and relatively easy to control, but it can get out of hand really quickly, so you have to be mindful of that. You're also talking about end grain wood with chips, so it strips a lot of the harsher character out of the wood as well as the sort of vanillas and the smoothness. So oak chips is like a punch over the head with oak.
Yes. Yeah, my experience using chips is a small amount goes a long way, and you can overdo it really easily.
Very easily. Oak staves is my kind of preferred way to oak things. So you get like little sticks, and you can add like one or two and see how you're going. If you're not getting enough over a period of time, you can chuck another one in there. It draws the stuff out of the oaks a lot slower, and because it's a mid-grain, it's a warmer, more rounded oak character that you get from it than the chips, which is quite sharp.
Yep. So it depends on what your goals are, I think, Garth. Chips, if you're wanting a quick turnaround and you're just wanting to get a oaky flavour quickly, or staves, better, but then you've got to age the beer for longer and keep the staves in there for longer. And then we've got barrels.
And then barrels, yeah. So barrels, there's a lot of work goes into barrels. You've got to make sure the wood's adequately soaked and clean and all the things you need it to be before you put the beer into it. Otherwise, it just leaks out the holes. And then there's all these different variables that come into play, like how much contact area your beer has, depending on the size of the barrel. So like a smaller barrel will get the same oak character in a much shorter period of time than a bigger barrel, just purely based on how much of the beer is in contact with how much of the wood. There's the amount of air that's getting at your beer. There's a lot of different variables that come into play with barrels.
And you've got to pretty much, yes, well, like you say, the maintenance part is a lot of it too. You've got to pitch it. Once you empty the barrel, you've got to put something in there straight away, whether it's a treated water or...
But the flip side of that is there's a romance to using barrels.
Yeah.
And there's something really special about it. And you're going to get a different thing from a different barrel. You're going to get a different thing from the same barrel each time you use it. And the journey that the barrel goes on is going to influence each new thing you put into it is going to take on character from the thing that was in there before. So there's definitely something to be said for the romance of barrels.
Yep.
And you'll get unique things that you won't be able to get in a more sanitized kind of putting some oak staves into a glass container with your liquid and being very controlled and measured about what you're getting out of it.
Gus just made another point about that slight oxidized quality that barrels bring. Trying to get that artificially, if you're aging in glass, perhaps it's a bit difficult. Plastic, is if you could age in
glass
plastic.
with a cork instead of a bung is a cool trick for that. So with all my, with all the spirits that I find when I'm going on a little walk and looking for glass jars full of whiskies and assorted other things.
It's funny how they just seem to be floating.
Yeah, I'm just really good at looking for them and finding them.
I don't know how you do it.
It's amazing. I always use a cork instead of a bung, and like the looser the cork, the better, because you get just breathing happening.
A little bit of
that, as opposed to like if you shove like a silicone bung or a rubber bung in there, then you're shutting off any kind of ingress of air in and out of the jar. The cork just allows it to breathe. So I find that I get a better result from that, and I get more of that sort of. I don't know how much more.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify these sorts of things.
It's hard to know if I had the same amount of oak exposure over the same amount of time, one with it in a glass container with a bung and one in a barrel. It'd be interesting to notice the differences between the two, purely on the amount of nice oxidation you got from them, because like there'd be other variables.
Exactly.
There's so many variables with all of these things, it's hard to kind of quantify. But it would be interesting to know sort of how much, and there'd probably be tests you could do to figure that out as well. But I'm a home brewer, I'm a humble home brewer, so I just kind of play around and experiment and do the best I can with what I've got. I'm also a control freak, which is why I like to go the glass with staves option. Because I'm more in control of what's going on, and I'm less likely to go overboard, and I can regularly smell and taste and use like my eyesight as well. I can look at the colour and see where it's going.
It tends to be the way I do it too. Well, there you go. Yeah, Garth, so cork, or you could find yourself a barrel if you're really keen. We sell them at the shop from time to time.
We do.
Or join a homebrew club if you're not in one already.
Yeah.
I know they do barrel sort of buys from time to time. They'll source a winery.
Yeah, I know the Mashers brought in like a big pallet of 20-litre barrels a little while ago from Tassie.
Okay.
Which all the members sort of got to put in money for and buy. So that was pretty cool. A lot of clubs do pretty awesome things like that, and give you access to things that you otherwise wouldn't have had access to.
Yeah.
And you can, I guess one of the good things about using glass that I've found is you don't have to limit yourself to oak.
Okay.
So I've done, again, I found some apple brandy on a walk. And rather than aging it on oak, I got my hands on some apple wood, chopped it up with
your own
hatchet, and toasted it in the oven in some foil, and then put the toasted apple wood into the apple brandy and let it age on that. And the apple flavour that's come out of that is intense. It's really strong and really prominent.
Interesting.
And like I think it tastes more like apples than the cider that was I'm assuming was originally
actually made
used to make the brandy. It's somehow put more apple flavour into it than it had after it was fermented.
There you go.
So it's really something you can play with. And it is an experimentation thing as well, because I'd heard a lot of people say that apple wood can give quite a lot of bitterness to spirits if you're not careful.
Right.
So it is something to play with if you put a lot of effort into creating something, and then you're down to the last little bit of aging it. Similar to woodworking, when you've done all the carving and all the sanding and the staining and everything, and you're ready to put the last coat of lacquer on, and then you stuff up the lacquer job, and you're just like, no.
Yes, yeah.
It's the same sort of thing with with this. Like you've say with like an apple brandy as an example, you've sourced all the apples, you've processed, like chopped them all up, turned them into mush, pressed them, got the juice, carefully fermented that, made a really good quality cider. Then you've run it through a still multiple times, you've painstakingly gone through each jar you've collected to figure out what tastes good and what doesn't, blended it all in, got it all ready to go, ready for aging, and then you've used like a wood that makes it really bitter, or you've overdone it, and then you've lost all that hard work that you've put into it. So
it's the risk.
It can be a good idea when you're doing experiments to pull off a small amount of your total quantity and experiment on that. And then if it works really well, the next time you take on that big project, then hopefully from taking really good notes, which we should all be doing,
take notes, people.
Exactly what you did and how to best replicate that in future kind of experiments.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, if there's no more
if chat has any more questions, feel free to ask them.
Otherwise, if anyone has any more questions, otherwise,
even like specific beer related questions as well, or brewing related questions. I don't know if we've got any sort of first time brewers.
Yeah, if there's any
popping in
beginners
to learn
out
about
there,
making beer.
I'm sure we've used a lot of terms that are probably a little confusing. We've got a question from Craig. He's asking whether we sell a fresh wort kit that's basically using this IPA, British IPA recipe or something like it.
Not this recipe, but we do have, so Chris's British Pale Ale, if you don't dilute it, if you just have it as it is, it's kind of sitting somewhere between a modern British IPA and an ESB.
Yep.
So like specific gravity would be about 1056 to 1060, somewhere in that range, undiluted. I don't know exactly off the top of my head. So you get a pretty good approximation of a British IPA, modern British IPA style. If you wanted to go more in this direction, it is a seasonal. I don't know if we've got them at the moment, but we do occasionally do a British barley one as well. That's going to be a lot closer to this sort of thing. Similar, probably not quite as bitter, but definitely similar kind of
richness
and
bigness,
maltiness and things.
Maybe
like
dry
that.
hop it.
And you could even boil some hops. Like you could get some Goldings hops, because you would probably add some water to that anyway. So get a couple of litres of water, throw some hops in there, boil them, get some bitterness out of them, and then throw that into your fermenter with your wort kit, and you get something pretty close to this. So you could definitely approximate it with some wort kits.
Yep.
We've got so many wort kits now. You could pretty much land on just about any different style.
Yeah, you could.
With a little bit of tweaking, maybe some steeping grains, some extra hops, different yeasts. It's funny actually, we a while ago when we had the Saison as our wort, because we've been doing a thing called Word of the Week, where we will basically each week we'll have a different wort kit on sale for that week, and we had Saison on, and we ran out of Saisons about halfway through that week. And funnily enough, our Aussie Draft fresh wort kit, which you wouldn't necessarily equate with a Saison, it's an almost identical
really good Saison
and hopping regime. So it's lower alcohol than the Saison.
Okay.
But other than that, it's the same type of malt. It's got the same sort of sugar content in there, like a bit of dextrose that we throw in there. Really similar hops. So if you take our Aussie Draft fresh wort kit and throw some Saison yeast at it, you've basically got a table strength Saison.
A little grisette.
Which is delicious,
yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
So you can really sort of, wort is one part of the puzzle.
Yeah, definitely.
But depending on what you do with it, you can get all sorts of things from the same starting point.
Cool. All right. Anyone else? The chat has gone quiet, so if there's any other questions, let us know. Or we might look at wrapping up in a bit. Yeah. So I hope you all learned something interesting about...
And I apologise if I got any names, dates and facts wrong, because it is always sort of a bit of a on-the-spot, lights in your face, cameras rolling...
Yeah, it is.
I kind of remember what happened there with that. And it is always, it's a contentious thing as well, because there is so much lore attached, and there is so much sort of legends and ideas attached to this style of beer, and specifically to the history of it and how it developed. So it is possible that I got a few things wrong. If that's the case, feel free to chuck a comment in the video once it's up and correct.
Absolutely. If there's any history nerds out there you want to add to the conversation.
Or if you've got some interesting facts as well about the development of the style and the history of it, then chuck them in the comments as well, because I love history. Like I've said, I'm terrible with dates and names, which sucks for history, but I really love to learn about it, learn about what happened and the historical context of things happening as well. I just find it really interesting. It's a great way to learn about things. It's not just looking at what the thing is, but when it is, why it is, who's involved, how it came about. Like you get a much richer understanding of what the thing is.
I think so. It gives you some context.
Where, like we've mentioned, taxes. Like
yes.
The reason why most English beers now are sort of much lower alcohol just all comes down to that one tax. And I think to this day, well, maybe not to this day because they're leaving the EU, but like for a while in the sort of 2000s, England was accounting for something like 40% of the EU's beer taxes was coming from England because of like the taxing system that
The way
they had
it worked. Okay.
So even still, like they're still quite heavily taxed on.
Yeah.
It's based on ABV now rather than gravity, but it's
Yes.
still
Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well,
definitely impacts the type of beers being brewed and the approach to brewing them.
Yeah, and here as well, where I don't have all the details, the specific details, but I know that the craft brewers are being taxed at the same rate as the larger macro brewers. So there was a campaign to try and give some tax breaks to the little guys, and
that impacts the type of beers that
they can
craft brewers are making
Yep.
as well. And I think as well, like we have sort of accepted that there's going to be a premium attached to certain beer styles.
Yep.
And a huge part of that comes down to the taxing as well.
Yep.
So yeah, it's all very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So if anyone has anything to add, please, chuck it in the comments below. We'd love for people to add to the discussion and share their expertise and thoughts. That's always a good way to contribute. I think rather than telling us all the ways we're doing it wrong.
Yeah. Do that as well. Do that as well. Because sometimes I might just be like so focused on blathering on to the camera that I've completely missed a vital step or not noticed something. So
but if you have
see that, let me know. Like call me out on it because it means that the beer's going to come out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we want to see.
And it also means that the folks in the chat who maybe aren't as familiar with brewing, who didn't pick up on it and might be trying to brew along or things like that, they learn as well not to do what Johnny Don't does.
Share your knowledge. That's what we want. Okay, so now, I think we'll call that a feed. Ben's just going to remove the malt pipe, and the brew will continue. If you are interested in the more specific steps on how to brew, we do have a brew in a bag video tutorial on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out if you want to learn how to brew in a very basic and easy way. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, I had fun this morning.
Yeah, hope you all learned something. I know I did. And we will catch you in a couple of weeks.
For Joel's?
We'll be doing a bit of a role reversal. We're doing some yeast basics.
So I apologise in advance for like the random static that you'll be seeing in next week's stream as I'm trying to be the producer.
I'm sure you'll be fine.